Hi everyone. Not seen you for a few days. I'm sorry. I've been really busy doing my garden up because it's been so sunny. You might notice I've got a bit of a red nose as well. So I hope you're all doing well. Hope you're all getting on with all your books that we gave you and all your home learning packs, but also enjoying the sunshine because it has been really nice. I'm going to read 2 chapters of the BFG today. I'm going to put one up now, and then I'm going to put one up later on for you so we can enjoy it twice today since I've not seen you for a few days. Alright, so the next chapter is someone that was on the telly actually the other day talking to our whole country, because the next chapter is called The Queen. Dawn came at last, and the rim of a lemon-coloured sun rose up behind the rooftops somewhere behind Victoria Station. A while later, Sophie felt a little of its warmth on her back and was grateful. In the distance, she heard a church clock striking bong, 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 bong. She counted the strikes. There were 7. She found it almost impossible to believe that she, Sophie, a little orphan of no real importance in the world, was at this moment actually sitting high above the ground on the windowsill of the Queen of England's bedroom, with the Queen herself asleep in there behind the curtain, not more than 5 yards away. The very idea of it was absurd. No one had ever done such a thing. It was a terrifying thing to be doing. What would happen if the dream didn't work? No one, least of all the Queen, would believe a word of her story. It seemed possible that nobody had ever woken up to find a small child sitting behind the curtains on his or her windowsill. The Queen was bound to get a shock. Who wouldn't? With all the patience of a small girl who has something important to wait for, Sophie sat motionless on the windowsill. How much longer? She wondered. What time do queens wake up? Faint stirrings and distant sounds came to her from deep inside the belly of the palace. Then, all at once, behind the curtains, she heard the voice of the sleeper in the bedroom. It was slightly blurred sleep talker's voice. "Oh no!" it cried out. "No! Don't! Someone stop them! Don't let them do it! I can't bear it! Oh! Please stop them! It's horrible! Oh, it's ghastly! No! No! She is having the dream, Sophie told herself. It must be really horrid. I feel so sorry for her, but it has to be done. After that, there were a few moans, then a long silence. Sophie waited. She looked over her shoulder. She was terrified that she would see the man with the dog down in the garden staring up at her, but the garden was deserted. A pale summer mist hung over it like smoke. It was an enormous garden, very beautiful, with a large, funny-shaped lake at the far end. There was an island in the lake, and there were ducks swimming on the water. Inside the room, beyond the curtains, Sophie suddenly heard what was obviously a knock on the door. She heard the doorknob being turned. She heard someone entering the room. "Good morning, Your Majesty," a woman was saying. It was the voice of an oldish person. There was a pause, and then a slight rattle of china and silver. "Will you have your tray on the bed, ma'am, or on the table?" "Oh, Mary, something awful has just happened." This was a voice Sophie had heard many times on the radio and television, especially on Christmas Day. It was a very well-known voice. "Whatever is it, ma'am? I've just had the most frightful dream. It was a nightmare. It was awful." "Oh, I am sorry, ma'am. Don't be distressed. You're awake now and it will go away. It was only a dream, ma'am." "Do you know what I dreamed, Mary? I dreamed that the girls and boys were being snatched out of their beds at boarding school and were being eaten by the most ghastly giants. The giants were putting their arms in through the dormitory windows and plucking the children out with their fingers. One lot from a girls' school and another from a boys' school. It was all so vivid, Mary. It was so real." There was silence. Sophie waited. She was quivering with excitement. But why the silence? Why didn't the other one, the maid, why didn't she just say something? "What on earth is the matter, Mary?" the famous voice said. There was another silence. "Mary, you've gone white as a sheet. Are you feeling ill?" There was suddenly a crash and a clatter of crockery, which could only have meant that the tray that the maid was carrying had fallen out of her hands. "Mary," the famous voice was saying rather sharply, "I think you'd better sit down at once. You look as if you're going to faint. You really mustn't take it so hard just because I've had an awful dream. That isn't the reason, ma'am." The maid's voice was quivering terribly. "Then for heaven's sake, what is the reason?" "I'm very sorry about the tray, ma'am." "Oh, don't worry about the tray. But what on earth was it that made you drop it? Why did you go as white as a ghost all of a sudden?" "You haven't seen the papers yet, ma'am. Have you, ma'am?" "No. What did they say?" Sophie heard the rustling of a newspaper as it was being handed over. "It's like the very dream you had in the night, ma'am." "Rubbish, Mary! Where is it?" "On the front page, ma'am. It's the big headline." "Great Scott!" cried the famous voice. 18 girls vanish mysteriously from their beds at Rodian School. 14 boys disappear from Eton. Bones are found underneath dormitory windows." Then there was a pause, punctured by gasps from the famous voice, as the newspaper article was clearly being read and digested. "Oh, how ghastly!" the famous voice cried out. "It's absolutely frightful. Bones under the windows, Mary. What can have happened? Oh, those poor children." "But, ma'am, don't you see, ma'am?" "See what, Mary?" "Those children were taken away almost exactly as you dreamed it, ma'am." "Not by giants, Mary." "No, ma'am, but the bit about the girls and boys disappearing from them dormitories, you dreamed it so clearly and then it actually happened. That's why I came over all queer, ma'am." "I'm coming over a bit queer myself, Mary." "It gives me the shakes, ma'am, when something like that happens. It really does." "I don't blame you, Mary." "I shall get you some more breakfast, ma'am, and have this mess cleared up." "No, don't go, Mary. Stay here a moment." Sophie wished she could see into the room, but she didn't dare move the curtains. The famous voice began speaking again. "I really did dream about those children, Mary. It was clear as crystal." "I know you did, ma'am." "I don't know how giants got into it. That was rubbish." "Shall I draw the curtains, ma'am? Then we shall feel better. It's a lovely day. Oh, please do." With a swish, the great curtains were pulled aside. The maid screamed, "Ah!" Sophie froze to the window ledge. The Queen, sitting up in her bed with The Times on her lap, glanced up sharply. Now it was her turn to freeze. She didn't scream as the maid had done. Queens are too self-controlled for that. She simply sat there, staring wide-eyed and white-faced at the small girl who was perched on her windowsill in a nightie. Sophie was petrified. You can see there the maid opening the curtains and Sophie just sitting there. I'm not sure she knows what to do. Curiously enough, the Queen looked petrified too. One would have expected her to look surprised, as you or I would have done if we discovered a small girl sitting on our windowsill first thing in the morning. But the Queen didn't look surprised. She looked genuinely frightened. The maid, a middle-aged woman with a funny cap on her head, was the first to recover. "What in the name of heaven do you think you're doing in here?" she shouted angrily at Sophie. Sophie looked beseechingly towards the Queen for help. The Queen was still staring at Sophie. Gaping at her would be more accurate. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes were round and wide as two saucers, and the whole of that famous, rather lovely face was filled with disbelief. "Now, listen here, young lady. How on earth did you get into this room?" the maid shouted furiously. "I don't believe it," the Queen was murmuring. I simply don't believe it." "I'll take her out, ma'am, at once," the maid was saying. "No, Mary. No, don't do that." The Queen spoke so sharply that the maid was quite taken aback. She turned and stared at the Queen. What on earth had come over her? It looked as though she was in a state of shock. "Are you all right, ma'am?" the maid was saying. When the Queen spoke again, it was in a strange, strangled sort of whisper. Tell me, Mary," she said. "Tell me, quite truthfully, is there really a little girl sitting on my windowsill, or is one still dreaming?" "She is sitting here all right, ma'am, as clear as daylight, but heaven knows how she got here." "Your Majesty is certainly not dreaming this time." "But that's exactly what I did dream," the Queen cried out. "I dreamed that as well. I dreamed there would be a little girl sitting on my windowsill in her nightie, and she would talk to me." The maid, with her hands clasped across her starched white bosom, was staring at her mistress with a look of absolute disbelief on her face. The situation was getting beyond her. She was lost. She had not been trained to cope with this kind of madness. "Are you real?" the Queen asked Sophie. "Yes, Your Majesty," Sophie murmured. "What is your name?" "Sophie, Your Majesty." "And how did you get onto my windowsill?" "No, don't answer that. Hang on a moment. I dreamt that part of it too. I dreamt that a giant put you there." "He did, Your Majesty," Sophie said. The maid gave a howl of anguish, "Oh!" and clasped her hands over her face. "Oh! Control yourself, Mary," the Queen said sharply. Then to Sophie she said, "You are not serious about the giant, are you?" "Oh, yes, Your Majesty. He's out there in the garden now." "Is he indeed?" the Queen said. The sheer absurdity of it all was helping her to regain her composure. "So, he's in the garden now, is he?" she said, smiling just a little. "He is a good giant, Your Majesty," Sophie said. "You need not be frightened of him." "I'm delighted to hear it," the Queen said, still smiling. "He's my best friend, Your Majesty." "How nice," the Queen said. "He's a lovely giant, Your Majesty." "I'm quite sure he is," the Queen said. "But why have you and this giant come to one's palace?" "I think you dreamed that part of it too, Your Majesty," Sophie said calmly. That pulled the Queen up short. It took the smile right off her face. She certainly had dreamed that part of it. She was remembering it now. How, at the end of her dream, it had said that a little girl and a big friendly giant would come and show her how to find the 9 horrible man-eating giants. But be careful, the Queen told herself. Keep very calm. Because this is surely not very far from the place where your madness begins. "You did dream that, didn't you, Your Majesty?" Sophie said. The maid was out of it now. She just stood there goggling. "Yes," the Queen murmured. "Yes, now you come to mention it, I did, but how did you know what I dreamed?" "Oh, that's a long story, Your Majesty," Sophie said. "Would you like me to call the big friendly giant?" The Queen looked at the child. The child looked straight back at the Queen, her face open and quite serious. The Queen simply didn't know what to make of it. Was someone pulling her leg? She wondered. "Shall I call him for you, Your Majesty?" Sophie went on. "You'll like him very much." The Queen took a deep breath. She was glad no one except her faithful old Mary was here to see what was going on. "Very well," she said. "You may call your giant." "No, wait a moment. Mary, pull yourself together and give me my dressing gown and slippers." The maid did as she was told. The Queen got out of bed and put on a pale pink dressing gown and slippers. "You may call him now," the Queen said. Sophie turned her head towards the garden and called out, "BFG! Her Majesty the Queen would like to see you." The Queen crossed over to the window and stood beside Sophie. "Come down off that ledge," she said. "You're going to fall backwards any moment." Sophie jumped down into the room and stood beside the Queen at the open window. Mary, the maid, stood behind them. Her hands were now planted firmly on her hips, and there was a look on her face which seemed to say, "I want no part of that fiasco." "I don't see any giant, sweetheart," the Queen said. "Please wait," Sophie said. "Shall I take her away now, Ma'am?" the Queen said. The maid said, sorry. "Take her downstairs and give her some breakfast," the Queen said. Just then, there was a rustle in the bushes beside the lake. Then, out he came, 24 foot tall, wearing his black cloak with the grace of a nobleman, still carrying his long trumpet in one hand. He strode magnificently across the palace lawn towards the window. The maid screamed, "Ah!" The Queen gasped. Sophie waved. The BFG took his time. He was very dignified in his approach. When he was close to the window where the 3 of them were standing, he stopped and made a slow, graceful bow. His head, after he had straightened up again, was almost exactly level with the watchers at the window. You can see the BFG there, striding towards the window in his cloak, with his trumpet. He's taller than all the trees, isn't he? "Your Majesty," he said, "I is your humbug servant." He bowed again. Considering she was meeting a giant for the first time in her life, the Queen remained astonishingly self-composed. "We are pleased to meet you," she said. Down below, a gardener was coming across the lawn with a wheelbarrow. He caught sight of the BFG's legs over to his left. His gaze travelled slowly upwards, along the entire height of the enormous body. He gripped the handles of his wheelbarrow. He swayed. He tottered. Then he keeled over on the grass in a dead faint. Nobody noticed him. Look, you see the gardener. So he had his wheelbarrow. He's fallen over. "Oh, Majesty!" cried the BFG. "Oh, Queen! Oh, Monarcher! Oh, Golden Sovereign! Oh, ruler of straight lines! Oh, Sultana, I is come here with my little friend Sophie to give her..." The BFG hesitated, searching for the word. "To give me a what?" the Queen said. "Assistance," the BFG said, beaming. The Queen looked puzzled. "He sometimes speaks a bit funny, Your Majesty," Sophie said. "He never went to school." "Then we must send him to school," the Queen said. "We have some very good schools in this country." "I has great secrets to tell Your Majesty," the BFG said. "I should be delighted to hear them," the Queen said. "But not in my dressing gown." "Shall you wish to get dressed, ma'am?" the maid said. "Have either of you had breakfast?" the Queen said. "Oh, could we?" Sophie cried. "Oh, please! I haven't eaten a thing since yesterday." "I was about to have mine," the Queen said, "but Mary dropped it." The maid gulped. "I imagine we have more food in the palace," the Queen said, speaking to the BFG. "Perhaps you and your little friend would care to join me." "Will it be repulsant snoscumbers, Majesty?" the BFG asked. "Will it be what?" the Queen said. "Stinky snoscumbers," the BFG said. "What is he talking about?" the Queen said. "It sounds like a rude word to me." She turned to the maid and said, "Mary, ask them to serve breakfast for 3 in the... I think it had better be in the ballroom. That has the highest ceiling." To the BFG, she said, "I'm afraid you will have to go through the door on your hands and knees. I shall send someone to show you the way." The BFG reached up and lifted Sophie out of the window. "You and I is leaving Her Majesty alone to get dressed," he said. "No, leave the little girl with me," the Queen said. "We'll have to find something for her to put on. She can't have breakfast in her nightie." The BFG returned Sophie to the bedroom. "Can we have sausages, Your Majesty?" Sophie asked. "And bacon and fried eggs?" "I think that might be managed," the Queen answered, smiling. "Just wait till you taste it," Sophie said to the BFG. "No more snoscumbers from now on." And that's the end of that chapter. So, Sophie and the BFG have met the Queen. The Queen has met a giant. The gardener fainted. And the maid, well, she didn't do much better, did she? And for the first time in his life, the BFG is going to have a real breakfast. It's quite exciting. And did you hear that they can't have breakfast in the normal room because the BFG is too big, so they have to go into the ballroom. So that's like a huge hall where normally they have dances and things like that. But the BFG is going to have breakfast with the Queen and Sophie in the ballroom. That is exciting. So that's the end of that chapter. The next chapter is titled The Royal Breakfast. So I think Sophie and the BFG are going to have breakfast with the Queen. Do you think that? Do you think the Queen is going to believe them about the giants? Do you think that the Queen's going to help them with the giant problem, because it's quite a big issue at the moment? Have a think about that. And if you've got a bit of time over the weekend, I've got a few ideas for bits of writing that you could be doing. Aurora did some really, really good writing about the BFG a few days ago in one of the other chapters. So I've got, let me think now, I've got 3 ideas that you could do. So choose one of them, don't have to do all 3. The first one is, I'd like you to write what happened, but instead of doing it from Sophie's point of view, I want you to do it from the maid's point of view. So she was just doing her normal job. She went to give the Queen her breakfast. They read the newspaper. The Queen told Mary, the maid, about her dream, didn't she? She dropped the breakfast. Now, you'd normally get in trouble for dropping the Queen's breakfast, so she dropped the breakfast. And then she met a giant for the first time. So you could write about what happened from the maid's point of view. You could pretend to be Mary the maid. You could write what happened from the gardener's point of view. He was just out doing his job in the garden, weeding the flower beds, mowing the lawn, trimming the trees, and then all of a sudden, he fainted because he saw a giant in the garden. So you could do the maid, you could do the gardener, or you could be very, very posh like I was and write from the Queen's point of view. So I want you to write what happened on that morning, either from the maid's point of view, if you want to, from the gardener's point of view, if you want to, or maybe even the Queen's point of view. All right? I think that will probably be about, if we were working in our English books, I think it would probably be maybe even a full page, definitely 20 lines, but maybe a full page. And I want you to try and do it in year 2 joined up writing, because I've seen a couple of people's writing over the last few days and it's not that good. We've not done much writing recently, so try really, really hard to think about keeping your small letters the same size and making your tall letters touch the top line if you're on lined paper. If you haven't got any lined paper, use a ruler and a pencil to draw yourself some lines. I normally do it 1 centimetre down to make you, so it'll help you be really, really neat then. So there's the Queen chapter. The next chapter is called The Royal Breakfast. All right, so I'll see you later, and hopefully my nose won't be any redder, otherwise I'll be in trouble. See you later, guys. Bye.